Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to make some remarks on the Burr-Tillis amendment to the Energy Bill 3175.
Without objection.
Mr. President, thank you. And to my colleagues, let me just say I'm embarrassed that I'm having to come to the floor and talk about an amendment that makes so much common sense, that embraces everything that I think a legislative branch, more importantly, the American people, support more than the protection of a species. I rise today to ask my colleagues to support the Corolla Wild Horse Protection Act. The amendment mirrors legislation that Senator Tillis and I introduced, Senate Bill 1204, and this bill has passed the House twice, in 2012 and 2013. And let me be specific. This bill directs the Secretary of the Interior to enter into an agreement with the Corolla Wild Horse Fund to provide for the management of free-roaming wild horses in and around Currituck National Wildlife Refuge. Now, as I've learned, most of North Carolina in the summer is inhabited by people from Virginia and Maryland, up and down the East Coast. As a matter of fact, of the area of the northern part of the Outer Banks where the wild horses are found, where there isn't a road, you drive on the sand to get there. 60% of the homes there are owned by Virginians, not North Carolinians, Virginians. And for hundreds of years, these horses have existed there, wild. As a matter of fact, it's such a part of North Carolina's history that in 2010, it was made North Carolina's state horse. People have seen these horses. They've seen them on the beach. They've seen them in between cottages. They've coexisted with the habitat for over 200 years. The turtles have thrived. The ducks have thrived. Wildlife has thrived. The species of habitat have survived. Because you know what? There's no better protector of the species than these animals. Because to eat what they need and not to remove the roots is to understand that you need that to repopulate, to keep you alive. But here's the problem. This herd has been mandated to be held at 60 horses. And by every scientific study that's done about genetics, you've got to get up above 100 or to 120 to have genetic sustainability. So what are we proposing? This act proposes that we bring 20 horses from the Shackelford Reserve and we integrate them into the horses on the Outer Bank, a mere 2 hours away. A herd that was similar from a standpoint of its creation. And we begin to inject genetics into this to where we don't have the genetic deformities that are beginning to be experienced with the Corolla horses. If we don't act now, we could lose these horses, and it's all due to genetic inbreeding. Now, the reason I'm embarrassed to be here is that this is something that ought to be done by unanimous consent. This is something that every person in this body should embrace. Yet the Fish and Wildlife Service is opposed to this. And there's nothing that says that Fish and Wildlife can't build a fence around the wildlife reserve. It has existed for hundreds of years in the wildlife reserve before it was designated a wildlife reserve and after. As a matter of fact, where these horses roam is on private land for 70% of the roaming land that they have. So the wildlife refuge is only 30%. But the 70% that's on private land, the private landowners are all for making this herd genetically sustainable. Now, if we don't do this legislatively, let me assure you, Fish and Wildlife is going to hold the number at 60. 60 will genetically burn out this herd. And as they reproduce, I don't know what Fish and Wildlife is going to do. The herd's at 80 today. It needs new genetics entered into it to change the trend, But Fish and Wildlife could go out tomorrow and they could shoot 20 horses. I'm sure they would probably tell us that they would take 20 horses and they would put them somewhere else. Where are they going to put them? Inject them into another genetic herd and increase the sustainability of those? Maybe so. But if you do it somewhere else, why wouldn't you do the same thing here? There's nobody in the public, no landowners that are clamoring to let this herd die out. As a matter of fact, there are 1.5 million people who have, in this country, that have expressed support for the sustainability of this. But this is one where science does dictate. The science says it's not sustainable if you leave this herd without a genetic injection from somewhere else. So I'm here to urge my colleagues. This is not a new proposal. It's passed the House twice. It's not a new proposal. Fish and Wildlife has done this in other places. For some reason, in North Carolina, they don't want to do it. And the last test for any member of Congress and for anybody in the public of this country should be, well, what does it cost us to do this? What am I asking you to pay to do this? The answer is zero. There's no federal cost to this. We sustain a herd for the future. It costs the taxpayers nothing. We have a private entity that takes responsibility for the management of the fund, and we don't in any way, shape, or form limit Fish and Wildlife from a standpoint of their ability to fence off whatever they believe is environmentally sensitive. And we have horses that for over 200 years have lived with ducks and geese and sea turtles and never seen a problem with it. Mr. President, you've been patient. And I would say to my colleagues, don't make a mistake. Support this legislation. It's the right thing to do. It costs the taxpayers no money, and it embraces everything that I think America stands for, and that's preservation of the history of this country. And believe it or not, these horses represent over 200 years of history in North Carolina, and that's why we made them our state horse. I thank the presiding officer. I yield back. Suggest the absence of, I yield back.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m.